Thank you, Mr. Acting President. I would like to start today by highlighting my disappointment with the rate at which the government thought it appropriate to rush through such a significant piece of legislation in this place. The legislation will impact every single South Australian and change the way in which our parliament and, more broadly, our democratic society will function. The government introduced and gave its second reading speech on the last sitting day and seeks to have all second reading contributions completed today and the bill passed by Thursday. I appreciate that the government may have the support of the majority of this chamber and that this bill is likely to pass, but members of this parliament and the broader South Australian community frankly deserved more respect than the government has afforded. The ability for members of this place to be able to consult on the introduced legislation for more than a week would have been, I would have thought, a good place to start if the Malinauskas government is in fact legislating a voice to Parliament for the betterment of all South Australians, in particular for the improvement of lives for Indigenous South Australians. One has to wonder, why has there been such a rush? Whilst I appreciate the government has a mandate when it comes to this legislation, as it formed one of their long list of election commitments, I put it to this chamber that most South Australians were likely unaware of this commitment when they went to the ballot box in March 2022. I think they were probably more focused on the chalked ambulances and scare campaign that was run by the Labor Party and Ambulance Employees Association around ramping. The slogan, "Vote Labor like your life depends on it," because it just might, tends to have that effect. We are around 11 months into the Malinauskas government's term, and there has not been a delivery on their commitment to fix ramping. In fact, it is worse than it was then. Yet here we are today with the now not-so-new Malinauskas government urgently forging ahead with a state-based voice to Parliament, with limited engagement on the final bill with the public and the view to having this done and dusted by tea on the third day. I note the federal government is moving to hold a referendum on their proposed voice, and it would have been beneficial for members of this place to see the results of any federal referendum, where the views and opinions of the public, in particular the South Australian electorate, is respectfully engaged before this legislation was brought to this place on such an important topic which this parliament cannot afford to get wrong. I recognise it's been said on both sides of the chamber, but the way in which members in this place vote on this bill will have a long-term impact for generations to come. The support or otherwise of this bill is not a decision to be made lightly or to be made under the emotionally charged belief that a novel idea such as that proposed in this bill is somehow the only mechanism to resolving what are deeply complex, varying and generational issues which have impacted the Indigenous communities in this state. In my belief, a voice to Parliament seeks to create an unfortunate divide in our state based on race. An important pillar of our democracy is that we are all equal, one person, one vote. We, here in Australia, have the privilege of electing our members of Parliament. The South Australian community have the opportunity to elect a Member of Parliament that they believe will best represent their interests to create a South Australia that they can be proud of. A South Australia where opportunities are created so that individuals and communities can prosper. People of our state may not always be satisfied with the outcome of an election, but come the next one, South Australians are yet again given the opportunity to have their say at the ballot box. With respect to those opposite, the establishment of a voice to Parliament undermines the very premise of equal representation, giving greater weight to a vote of one group over another and to create barriers to representation based on race. It creates a situation where, if you are of a certain race, you get 2 votes on election day, one to the South Australian Parliament and another to the voice to Parliament. Generations before us have fought hard and continue to fight for the harmonious ideal that we are all equal before the law and that all votes should be counted as equal. We are a country, or at least I hope we are, who believe that your race, ethnicity, sex or religion does not and should not determine what opportunities you have in your life. The premise that one person's voice is worth more than another, or that someone would not be given the same opportunity purely based on race, is not the Australia I know. I cannot stand here in this place, particularly in this chamber, which represents and reviews the laws of this land for over 1.7 million South Australians equally, and support any bill that aims to legislate for the creation of what is effectively a third chamber based on race at the highest level, our South Australian Parliament. This Parliament must lead by example. If we expect the broader community to not discriminate or limit one's opportunity based on race, religion or gender, then tell me how establishing a voice to Parliament teaches our children that we are all equal. We cannot expect our children to be inclusive in the schoolyard and then at the highest level, our Parliament, seek to divide people on race by relegating one group to a third chamber to advise us what's good for them when is convenient. We are a nation who strive to be a fair and tolerant society, and the Parliament must be the place for all South Australians, whether from Indigenous communities or otherwise. Creating an expensive administrative third chamber of Parliament for Aboriginal South Australians sends the wrong message. This wrongly tells South Australians that the Parliament is not for all South Australians. Arguably, this wrongly tells Aboriginal South Australians this Parliament, in its current form, is not for them. This was highlighted by the second reading speech of the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs when he said, "Far too often in our history post-colonisation, it has been the practice of governments at every level not to invite and quite often not to permit Aboriginal people to be included in or contribute to the decisions that directly affect their lives. This means decisions have been made for Aboriginal people and not with them." He says the bill ensures the voices of First Nations people in South Australia are heard directly by this Parliament and by South Australian government. He also says we can become the first jurisdiction in the nation to legislate for a voice to Parliament and a voice to government for First Nations people, empowering them to shape decisions instead of being subject to them. Mr President, I put it to you that Aboriginal South Australians already have a voice. It is in this Parliament, it is in every single one of us. It is in our Attorney-General and Aboriginal Affairs Minister, an Indigenous person himself. It is in our federal Parliament, where they have great Indigenous representation, 11 MPs who identify as or descend from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, all of whom were able to achieve this through existing channels and without the need for a separate body of elected members. Here, in this Parliament, is the best place for Indigenous Australians and their representatives, us, to champion for their communities. So the question really is, why does the government feel they need what is essentially an expensive administrative third chamber of Parliament to tell them what they should already know? Why not just get on with tackling the issues Indigenous communities are facing, while hearing the input they have already received from the numerous advisory bodies established in this state, of which this voice regrettably seems to ignore? While I disagree with this legislation on principle, I hold concerns on the drafting of this bill, not limited to the costs, electoral processes, gender allocations and the effective doubling up of advisory resources to government. The legislation has not provided a clear outline as to the anticipated remuneration, allowances or expenses for members, let alone what the overall cost will realistically be. Nor has the legislation provided a cap on how many committees can be established, of which members can be remunerated. I query whether this is a blank cheque South Australian taxpayers are being asked to write to the government to create a voice to Parliament with limited transparency and information available to date. While the same criticisms around transparency and particulars have been levelled at the federal government in the media in recent months, at least that exercise will face the electorate via referendum later this year, with voters able to determine themselves whether they have enough detail to make an informed decision on whether that change should or should not be implemented. I understand that there has been $10 million allocated to run this body over the next 4 years, which I would note would go a long way if it were put towards some other tangible, meaningful solutions. Perhaps some extra resourcing to assist with the poor health and education outcomes often facing Indigenous Australian communities, better measures around children in the child protection system, improved prevention of family and domestic violence, tackling substance abuse issues amongst Indigenous youth and seeking to decrease the disproportionate adult incarceration rates amongst Indigenous communities. The list goes on. The way in which our parliament legislates and provides funding must be needs-based, not race-based. I have highlighted in this chamber in recent weeks that the Alexander report, published at the end of last year on a review of the child protection in South Australia, highlighted that in addition to a need for increased spending on early intervention measures, there needs to be a deliberate and vastly increased investment in early intervention and family preservation services for Aboriginal families. The report notes that the spending on Aboriginal children and the services should be proportionate to their representation in the system, not the population. As reported, South Australia currently spends 3.4% of the child protection budget on Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, which is lower than most other Australian states and territories. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare 2020 to 2021 report on child protection in Australia states that there are 18,187 Aboriginal children in South Australia who make up 4.9% of the 369,658 total South Australian children. Nationally, Aboriginal children make up 6% of the total number of children. Although Aboriginal children make up 4.9% of the total number of children in South Australia, they make up 34.5% of the children who received protection services in 2020 to 2021, yet only received 3.4% of the child protection budget, which is spent on Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. I therefore query whether the $10 million allocated over the next 4 years would make a more tangible difference to Indigenous communities if it was spent on issues like this one, rather than on an expensive administrative body. Is $10 million spent before Indigenous communities see any additional funding or policies from initiatives of the Voice? In isolation, in my view, this body will really not be able to do much to improve the outcomes of Indigenous communities. To be clear, I do not believe that simply splashing cash is the solution either. But where reports such as the Alexander report already highlight the issues out there in some of these communities, it is not clear how the government's proposed Voice aims to solve these matters already known. Another concern, as relates to the drafting of this bill, is around the electoral processes proposed for the composition of the Voice, particularly as relates to the appointment of processes where a casual vacancy arises within 18 months of the local First Nations Voice election. In no other elected position to Parliament, to my knowledge, would a casual vacancy be filled by the next person who received the next highest number of votes to that election. Putting aside the party political appointment process, members engage here in this chamber. On a state electorate basis, however, if there were a casual vacancy, either by a by-election would be held, or by instances of the Legislative Council or the Senate, a pre-selection may be held internally within the relevant political party. But ultimately, the decision falls back to the South Australian community to have their say. To appoint someone who did not have a quota and therefore arguably did not have the support and backing of their community is not in the best interests of their community or our state. To put that into context here, that is like if an electorate voted for a Liberal Member of Parliament who subsequently retired, and that position was then offered to a person who received the next highest number of votes in that election, the other major party, Labor. They may have only received, say, 30% of the votes after preferences, and may clearly have different values and vision than that of the majority of their community. But with this logic, they would be offered the role and appointed to same, something that their community may be unlikely to accept on the whole. Whilst naturally it may not be a contest between the major parties, there will naturally be competing personalities, community groups, family groups that may play a part in the First Nations elections, which runs a risk that flaws in this system may lead to unnecessary conflict and division within the electorate. The State Voice will not only have a legislated right to address both Houses of Parliament on any matter it wishes, but also a guaranteed right to speak to the State Cabinet and to CEOs of state government departments. It is my understanding that currently, unless the Houses rule otherwise, only elected members of Parliament have the ability to stand on the floor of Parliament to advocate for their communities. I'm sure there are many South Australian community groups who would love the opportunity to stand on the floor of Parliament, all of whom have an equally important message to share. Like all of us, such members must run for Parliament to be able to stand on the floor of this place to speak on behalf of their community. This legislation acts to change the very way in which our parliament will function. The most recent version of this bill has also implemented an 11th-hour change before its introduction, a proposal to amend the Constitution Act 1934. Whilst I appreciate that, unlike its federal counterpart, the state constitution is simply an act of this parliament which can be amended by both houses, I hazard a guess that most South Australians would agree perhaps a referendum, or in reality a plebiscite, might have been a more appropriate manner in which this government could have put such a significant, if only symbolic, change to the South Australian people, to ask them what type of recognition they wish to have embodied in their state's primary governing document. Notably, in the amendment, it says, through the First Nations Voice Act 2023, that voice will be heard and will make unique and irreplaceable contributions to South Australia that benefits all South Australians. It will have been advisable for all South Australians to have had an opportunity to give their voice on the Voice's creation. Notably, not all South Australians will partake in the Voice, despite this amendment providing for all. Furthermore, this bill ignores existing engagement methods, which could and should better be utilised, and instead deliberately steers clear of the long-standing bodies. One has to wonder whether this long-term impact will be the watering down of the voices of the many existing methods of advice provided to the government of the day. In an in-daily article written by Matthew Abraham on the First Nations Bill on the 10th of February 2023, he shared an excerpt from the magazine America, which reads, "Before we voice a preference on public policy, whether in the voting booth or talking with family members over dinner, we should consider one question with two parts. First, what are the costs of choosing the wrong policy? And second, who would have to bear those potential costs? If the wrong solution is chosen, a problem will likely persist as before or even be made worse." Mr. President, something about this question has stuck with me throughout the very short courage of this debate and the short time I have had. I have pondered over my position on this bill and the message I think it sends not just to Indigenous communities, but to the South Australian community at large. I think, like all South Australians, my firm belief is that Indigenous communities in South Australia deserve a seat around the table to speak up about the issues that impact their communities, often disproportionately in matters of great importance. But where I differ is my belief that the table should not be pushed off to the side and relegated to some third chamber, funded on a discretionary basis by the executive government of the day and burdened by bureaucracy and symbolism. The voice for these communities is and should be here in this parliament, as representatives of all South Australian communities at large and within the existing framework of our great democracy that treats every vote equally, no matter who you are. The very people this bill seeks to assist may very well be the people it disadvantages the most. As members of this parliament, it is our responsibility to make sure that the voices of all South Australians are championed in our parliament. I think it is time that we refrain from virtue signalling and we just get on with the job. A voice to parliament is not the solution.
The Honourable Ms Girolamo.